One brief thing to mention before I get to actual Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is that, especially in the stage versions and a lot of the film versions, Jekyll and Hyde and Frankenstein were really like, they kind of cross-themed. People would adapt them in certain ways. For example, Frankenstein is quite commonly adapted on the stage, and even some of the early like silent films, like the Edison Company film, is sort of a Jekyll and Hyde story. I've even heard of a literary professor try to argue that the creature didn't really do the killings. It's actually Victor Frankenstein himself. It's sort of an alter ego, a dual, this psychological portrayal or take on Frankenstein's story, which is not there in the text. It can be an interesting thing thematically to think about. The creature representing Victor's sort of id or something like that. But no, it is his creation. It's something that he made and left behind and didn't take responsibility for, and so forth. But I just want to mention that those stories have always been linked when the public consciousness is trying to process them and trying to find out how we want to apply them. Both Mary Shelley and Robert Louis Stevenson, who wrote The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, they both lived to see stage adaptations of their work before they passed away. Bram Stoker is the only one who didn't quite live to see that. We'll talk more about him next week and Dracula next week. But if Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was, she had the idea of it in 1816. I think the first edition came out 1819. And then, of course, 1831, I think, was the last edition. Me in numbers, so I might add those numbers slightly off. But that's the basic gist of it, the time period. Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is published in Britain. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was published in Britain too. But Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was influenced a lot by Robert Louis Stevenson's own hometown in Edinburgh, Scotland. And this is the late century, 1888, I think the novella is originally published. Might be that. But the idea is that, we've got the bulk of a century having passed, and we've gone from the Regency period. Remember last time we talked about how Frankenstein, Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, all that took place in the Regency era, called that because you had George IV was too young to rule. After George III was deemed mad and unfit to rule, okay, well, George IV is going to take the crown, but he's too young, so a regent had to rule for him, until he was of age. So they call that era the Regency era. And that's the era portrayed, as I said before, in like the Downton Abbey and a lot of those, silly little soap operas and stuff that you see today, because it was just a sort of a juicy era to tell sort of a melodrama in. On the one hand, you still had, certainly in Britain in places, the traditional aristocracy, which is flashy in this, styles and everything. But you also had these new ideas of the Enlightenment pouring in. So there's places or room for, affairs and all kind of stuff that soap operas love. By the time we get to Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Hyde, though, we've moved from the Regency period to the Victorian era. Queen Victoria, gave her name to this era. And it's an important different area, as the century progressed. A lot of different things happened, especially in Britain. But for one thing, it's the Industrial Revolution is taking place. A lot of people are moving from the rural areas into the cities, so city populations are swelling. There's a giant divide between the poor and the rich, especially in the cities. This is Charles Dickens, this area, so think about the Dickensian stories or movies you've seen, whether it's Christmas Carol or Oliver or anything like that. This is the era we're talking about and dealing with now. Robert Louis Stevenson is raised in Edinburgh, Scotland. And one of the things about the Victorian era, especially in Britain, is that the Enlightenment's still going on. The Enlightenment's still going on, advances in medicine, advances in science. But there's also a real need to maintain appearances, especially in the Victorian era, for the upper classes. There's a real need to maintain, your reputation, to avoid the appearance of evil. The French Revolution happened, and it was, the people kind of learned their lesson a little bit and scaled down a bit. But there's still the need to basically, just use the word, that's a facade, to maintain a facade for a lot of people. So this is just true. It's a theme of the Victorian times. Stevenson is raised in Scotland. Now, Scotland was heavily Calvinist at this point, heavily Presbyterian, Scottish Presbyterian. John Knox had brought Calvinism there. And what we see from even before Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but with the Enlightenment, is a slow, steady progression away from any kind of authority or centralized authority. And we saw that, I mean, that, whether you're, yay Protestantism or not, that is something that happened when the Protestant sects broke off from the Catholic Church. They're saying no to the Catholic Church's authority. And then many of them were left, okay, well, what is our authority? And they had different ideas about that. And so many of the Protestant sects broke off of themselves, and you had different people breaking off on their own and different ideas of authority. And we get to the point, again, you say Protestantism, that's 1,000 different beliefs and flavors. So I'm not trying to lump all of them into one. But John Calvin was certainly a distinct thinker in Protestantism. And Calvinism named for him, of course. Now, people today that you might talk to who say they subscribe to Calvinism or whatnot, again, even the word Calvinism can mean a lot of different things. But I'm going to talk about exactly what it meant in terms of Scottish Presbyterian Calvinism. So when you think Jekyll and Hyde, I see Ghost Planet Maxine talking about the Hulk, Incredible Hulk. We use Jekyll and Hyde in the vernacular. We tend to use it to say somebody kind of has a schizophrenic tendencies or something. You might say, oh, they're kind of a Jekyll and Hyde personality or something, which is horrible for somebody actually diagnosed with schizophrenia, but just anybody kind of turning hot and cold on you. Stories of Jekyll and Hyde, there's an evil side and a good side, or, in terms of a superhero, a strong side it's unbridled, and the more self-controlled side or something like that. All of these have their seeds of truth that go back to the original work. But the original novella, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, is quite different. You meet in that story Dr. Jekyll, who is a doctor like Dr. Frankenstein. Now, Frankenstein wasn't technically a doctor in the original novel. He was a college student, but he was a student of the sciences, a student of medical science, probably would have, become a doctor. We call him Dr. Frankenstein in the film version, certainly. But you got these two doctors there, and they're both playing God with science. Dr. Jekyll is playing with chemistry and trying to achieve a godlike action with these chemicals. But in the original novella of Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dr. Jekyll wants to separate his evil side, separate his baser nature, because he says within every man there's two natures. There's two men, one good, one evil. And he says if we can separate the two out, then the evil can go do his thing and the good can go do his thing, and the two won't struggle with each other, won't besmirch each other. So basically, in the Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dr. Jekyll wants to let his dark side out. He wants to go out and do all of the dark, wicked things that he's got a dark nature that wants to do. He wants to be able to do that and not be repressed by the Victorian era or his religion and so forth. And you think that, and I've taught this to students before, or I've been in literature classes before, and they think, I've heard the question, well, why is this whole thing with the chemicals, and why is he trying to alter himself chemically? If you want to go out and let your dark side loose, why didn't you just wear a disguise? So he could go out and do whatever he wanted to, no one would recognize him, and he'd come back. And that's a good question, right? Except that it fails to take into account the religious context of the time and of the story, because the story immediately was taken as sort of an allegory of good and evil, like a object lesson, so to speak. I'm going to read a passage from the Bible, passage from Romans, and this is a basic idea of how Christianity sees the two natures of man. And then we'll talk a little bit more specifically of how Stevenson would have been thinking about this. But this is a passage from Romans, Romans 7. We know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold into slavery to sin. What I do not understand, for I do not do what I want, but I do what I hate. Now, if I do what I do not want, I concur that the law is good. So now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. So you've got this idea that there are two natures within man, the flesh and the spirit. And you're trying to give over the will of the flesh, to mortify the flesh for the power of the Spirit to take over. Now, in Catholic Christianity, certainly, which held sway in Scotland for a long time before Presbyterianism kind of uprooted it, the Mary Queen of Scots, was from Scotland as well. Here's the thing about Calvinism, though, and this is one attribute I didn't mention, and this is what we really see in Jekyll and Hyde. One of the tenets of Calvinism is the total depravity of man. Now, I'm obviously not a Calvinist. I don't believe in Calvinism. I'm a Catholic. Catholicism, which held sway through Europe, even in Scotland, for a long time before the different factions of Protestantism, and certainly Calvinism, really took root in Scotland. Catholicism says that everything God created is good. Now, it becomes corrupted by sin and sin nature, but it's basically God doesn't create anything that's not good. So you're not totally depraved. You need to work on choosing good over evil, just in a nutshell. There's a whole philosophical conversation we can have. The idea of salvation is that you need to cooperate with grace. Grace saves you, sure, you're saved by grace, it's not by works, but you need to cooperate with that grace. Salvation isn't a one-time thing. It's not just, you say this special prayer and boom, you're saved forever. It's okay, you're saved, now you need to cooperate with that grace. So you need to grow in good works and grow in holiness and give yourself to that spiritual side of yourself and say no to your flesh and so forth. That's part of your being saved. That's part of your daily walk. But the tenet of Calvinism, that the total depravity of man, is that there's nothing good you can do. There's not even anything remotely like a good work you can do. There's nothing you can do that would even look like cooperating with saving grace. Everything good of you in your life comes from God doing it through you. Again, sometimes it can kind of seem like it's a matter of logistics, cooperating with grace versus, taking on the regeneration of a predestined, elect or whatever. But that depravity of man is a real tenet that you can see reflected in the character of Mr. Hyde. Strict Scottish Presbyterian Calvinism at the time said that God already decided who was going to heaven and who was going to hell. And if you're going to heaven, there's nothing you can do about it. You're going to go to heaven. You're once saved, always saved, that kind of idea, if you're one of the elect in that point. And if you're not one of the elect, then you're damned. You're going to hell, and there's nothing you can do about it. One way you know if you're one of the elect going to heaven is if you are being regenerated. You're becoming holier, and there's nothing you can do about it. You're just automatically doing it, right? It's God just planned it for you to happen. He chose you. He predestined you in that manner. So one way to know for sure that you're going to heaven is that if you are becoming better, being good, and so forth. So you might think, isn't that sort of semantic or logistics a little bit playing with, but it's a slightly different philosophy. This is a profoundly different philosophy, but that's the idea. So think about Dr. Jekyll in this story. He knows that he has these two natures. It's not about if he just puts a mask on and goes out and does these wicked things that he wants to do. Well, that would be proof that he's going to hell, But if he can somehow let his evil side have its way, that it wouldn't mar his good side, wouldn't mar the soul of his good side and so forth. That's what he's trying to achieve in that story. Now, the novella doesn't really go into the ins and outs of religion, certainly talks about transgressing God and so forth here and there. But Stevenson certainly had that mindset. He was an avowed atheist, but he grew up a very strict Calvinist upbringing in Edinburgh. He was a very sickly child. He had some sort of condition of the lungs. They thought it was tuberculosis for a time, but it tends to not really fall into that category. His skeleton was sort of like distended. He had a lot of lung infections and hemorrhages just throughout his life. He had a nurse growing up who was a really strict, like evangelical Presbyterian Calvinist, and she would tell him stories from the Bible, and she would tell him about how you want to make sure that you're one of the good elect going to heaven and not one of the bad evil people not going to heaven. And that would give him a lot of anxiety. He'd have nightmares about that because, you think about it, you tell that to a child, it's like, hey, you've been chosen to either go to heaven or hell, and there's nothing you can do about it. So if you're going to go to heaven, you better start, you'll be good, which is a sign that you were chosen to go to heaven, So it's a real mind game, right? And he'd have nightmares about that. It's one of the reasons that he decided to at least call himself an atheist. Now, even though he was calling himself an atheist growing up, or once he was older, he never really left the Christian morals. He always admired Christian morality. And, a lot of people who call themselves atheist, if you really have a talk it out in the conversation with them, more often than not, they're going to end up being more agnostic than atheist, because it's really hard to be a 100% total materialistic atheist. I mean, people out there are, would say they are, but it's kind of hard to really wrap all your worldviews around that. So he always had that strong Calvinist morality through his life and upbringing, and it certainly showed in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There are some influences also to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Remember, I talked about how Victorian era, there is a strong dichotomy between the lower class and the upper class, and there's a real drive to maintain your reputation and so forth. Stevenson went to the University of Edinburgh, and Edinburgh at the time was a divided city. It's kind of one of the influences of Jekyll and Hyde because it was an old town. It was divided into Old Town and New Town. So Old Town was still the medieval architecture. Old Town was where the prostitutes were. The Old Town was where the drinking and the gambling took place and all that stuff. New Town was the more Victorian architecture, the more sort of upscale, aristocratic area. And Stevenson would go to school in Uptown, and then he would spend his nights in Old Town, in New Town. He would spend his nights in Old Town. As a college student, he was out there whoring and gambling and everything with the rest of them. And this was part of his rebellion, against the idea of religion and whatnot. So this is one influence. He himself became a well-known writer of children's literature. First, he was an essayist, and he, he had that nurse who he dearly loved. He dearly loved his nurse. He called her Cummy. Her name was Cunningham, and I think it was his way of mispronouncing the name as a child. But he dearly loved his nurse. She was very, dear to him. He loved his mother and stuff. He had a penchant for older women. It's kind of hard not to read some mommy issues into this somehow or another. But he fell in love with his actress, this divorced actress, which was a scandal to be divorced in the day. She was separated, wanting to get a divorce. He fell in love with her. She was about 10 years older than him. She did not reciprocate the love, but she allowed a friendship and a correspondence through the mail, happen quite a bit. He eventually found Fanny Osborne, who he was about 10 years his senior as well. And she was divorced with a child, and he eventually married her once she was actually properly divorced. She was an American. And he was an essayist up to that point. Really great essays. He's a great writer. I love his work. I really do. He's great. Once he married Fanny Osborne and he suddenly had this 12-year-old stepson, he started writing down stories, like adventure stories that he would tell to the son. And like I said, even though he might call himself an atheist, his works are very moral. They're very moral, and they all have very heavy moral lessons. But Treasure Island, this comes from Robert Louis Stevenson. Kidnapped, if you heard of that one. What's it called? The Black Rose. A lot of great stuff from Robert Louis Stevenson. Treasure Island is probably his most famous, aside from Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And he was known as sort of that children's religion, adventure, story author. But there's this one summer where he's having a lot of lung hemorrhaging. He's feeling horrible. He's got a home in Bournemouth, I think it is, where a lot of people go to sort of convalesce in England. So he's in this nice home, but he's just bedridden with these lung issues, and he has these horrible nightmares. We don't know exactly what caused them. He wakes up from a nightmare and just sort of in this mad fueled frenzy, he writes these drafts of the Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Hyde story. And it's almost like it's almost like a drug fueled frenzy. Now we don't know for sure, but people were taking cocaine back then, like aspirin. It was just sort of this new root from the tropics or whatever, and it was it was being prescribed by doctors for everything from a headache to anything, sleep or whatever. So it's quite possible that he might have been taking a little bit of cocaine for his lung or whatever issue, but it certainly would speak to the frenzy that he wrote in or whatever. But he wrote this story out, and you do see a lot of things from the era and from his subconscious coming through in here. Now, he would say things about the story later, and his wife certainly says things about the story later that you can kind of see where they're trying to sort of distance themselves or trying to make sure that they're seen in a certain way. His wife in particular she wanted him to be seen as the beloved children's author and not the writer of such a wicked tale, and stuff. So she was trying to just say, no, it's just an allegory for good and evil. And that's all it is, and whatnot. But he, growing up, he had a dresser in his room that was made by an individual named Deacon Brodie. And this will just give you an idea of the times and how we've progressed to Victorian England from say, the Regency period, post French Revolution and so forth. Deacon Brodie was a cabinet maker and a nobleman there in Scotland. He was a councilman, all of these things, but he was a cabinet maker. So he started making impressions of the keys to the people's, his clients, basically, to get into their homes. And he started, stealing from them. Eventually he started stealing. He stole from a bank. He stole he had some accomplices. It was a big scandal. It was a big deal. He's kind of sort of a beloved rogue character over there now. You'll see like pubs and everything named after him and whatnot. But he was on the run when he was found out. He was eventually caught and hanged and so forth. But young Robert Louis Stevenson grew up with a cabinet, having been made by Deacon Brodie. So there's that duality of life, the public self and then the private self that you try to keep hidden. Stevenson also had a friend, Chantrel, I forget his first name, Monsieur Chantrel, who's a French teacher, a Frenchman, who Stevenson would have been a colleague with, would have known, would have been one of his acquaintances. And Chantrel was, it came out later that he was a rapist. He raped this one young girl, and she didn't really have any recourse, or so he ends up marrying her, which was done sometimes horribly, but abusing her. Eventually, takes out a life insurance policy on her, and kills her. He poisons her with opium and so forth, trying to make it look like it was an accident, so he could get this life insurance. Was a really wicked individual, and once it came out, it was big news because he was this upstanding citizen, but he had this secret life. And Robert Louis Stevenson would have gone to his trials. He went to the trials. We know that much, hearing the stories and whatnot. And Chantrel was, to the very end, like they asked him, do you need anything in your prison cell? And he's like, send in some whores and some booze, I mean, and when they're about to execute him, he's like, I hate all, if I could end all of mankind, I would. I hate you all, and this and that, So it was very much like a Mr. Hyde character. I mean, if you see, especially some of the film versions of Mr. Hyde, like, dang, you see the influence coming from this Chantrel character. So a lot of those influences are around in society, and particularly in Stevenson's upbringing, with the strict Scottish Calvinism there. And he writes this story. It immediately is looked at as, like I said, a moral lesson of good and evil. Preachers talked about it from the pulpit. In fact, it's funny. A friend of mine, this would have been almost like 10 years ago now, but he played in he was an actor in local theaters and whatnot, and he got the role of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde from the musical. It's a great musical they did a few decades ago, and he played Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In the little local theater group that did it, they actually staged the play in a church. It was like some non-denominational, kind of evangelical, one of those with the big speakers and the music systems and like, hey, we're relevant kids, that kind of church. But they let them stage this play there, this play with hookers and prostitutes, the song Bring On the Men and all this kind of stuff, because the preacher of that church was tying it in like a 4-week sermon message on the duality of man or whatever, so it was a morality story back then, treated as such, and it's still treated as such today by a lot of people. Now eventually it was psychologized, as Freud becomes more popular, and we do start to look at Mr. Hyde as the id self, the dark side, the shadow self, id or shadow self of Jekyll. So Sound Engraver asking about that at one point. So that's certainly part of the story. But you can see different sort of waves of criticism or ways of looking at the story and interpreting the story in other ways. Now, I did say that Stevenson lived to see a play adaptation of Jekyll and Hyde, and this was by a man, if I'm not mixing up names of people at this point, his name was Henry Mansfield. He was an American actor, and he read the story. The story was immensely popular, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He read it and really thought it would be cool to play a dual role. That's not how it is in the book. In the book, Hyde is when he takes the chemicals or whatever and he becomes Hyde, he's suddenly a much younger person, shorter in stature, sort of simian-like, troglodyte is the word I think the text uses. But the idea is because he's the baser nature that hasn't really been given free reign to really express himself yet, but he's younger too. But it's always played in a live action, whether on stage or film, by the same actor usually, with a lot of makeup or effects or different things. So this Henry Mansfield character wanted to do a stage version of it. He's the one that brings in the idea that Jekyll was engaged to be married, or there's a fiance at some point. That's sort of a fixed part of the story now. If you watch any sort of Jekyll and Hyde adaptation, there's going to be a love interest, a fiance. And I think that's important. I think it's a natural progression of the story. Now, that wasn't in the original novella. Mansfield came to Britain and actually staged the play, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, at Bram Stoker's theater, Lyceum Theater. Bram Stoker was working as the stage manager for actors there at the Lyceum. And so Bram Stoker, the future author of Dracula, would have seen this play. And it was done in the West End, the nice part of London. And audiences were amazed at the transition that Mansfield would go through when he would become Hyde from Jekyll. He would crouch a little bit. He would, do a lot of actor tricks. There would also, the light would hit his face. Stage lighting would hit his face in a certain way. It would make him look very different. Audiences were just so wowed by this, this real transformation on stage that a good actor could portray. Stevenson eventually first liked the play. Mansfield came over and talked to Stevenson and read him the whole play, and Stevenson said it was great. Now, once some bad reviews started to come, or people started to question the morality of the play or whatever, Stevenson spoke out against it at that point, saying, it's stop trying to make Hyde so sexual. He's just our baser natures, but he's no more sexual than anybody else. That doesn't make any sense. Hyde has to be. If Hyde is our baser nature, then like all of his baser instincts, his sexual instinct has to be ramped up too. But again, author versus reader reaction, you need to balance the two. So Mansfield put on this play, and it was immensely popular. And like I said, it just wowed audiences. Then the Whitechapel murders happened while the Jekyll and Hyde play is being staged. So the Jekyll and Hyde play is on the West End, the nice area of London. Over in the East End, the Jack the Ripper, Whitechapel murders start to happen. Famous Jack the Ripper murders. No one knows who it is. It gets the name Jack the Ripper in the press. And some people even think, I don't know if it was serious or not, they even accused Henry Mansfield himself of being Jack the Ripper just because of his amazing transformation on stage. The police and the press, where they figured out that this Jack the Ripper character must be somebody from the upper class, at least that's the prevailing theory, who kind of goes and slums it and kills all these, prostitutes. So some people were even pointing the finger at Henry Mansfield. Of course, he's on stage acting while some of the murders are going on, so no one's seriously accusing him. But a lot of people in London at the time said, this play, with all of these horrible things that this Mr. Hyde character is doing, surely has influenced people. Surely it's a bad influence on culture. Surely it had something to do with this Jack the Ripper character going out and committing all these horrible atrocities on these women. And it got to be such a scandal that Mansfield actually had to close the run of the play. He closed it early, and he did the last night as a benefit for like jobs for the homeless or whatever over in the East End, as a benefit. And he famously came out and said, we're closing the play early because there are horrors enough outside. We don't need to keep playing horrors inside. There are horrors enough outside. It made a lot of people happy, whatever. But because of that, because of the play, because of the Jack the Ripper murders, that's really colored how we see the story, how we see the archetype of Jekyll and Hyde. it's the rampaging, uncontrollable murderer. In the book, Hyde only murders one person, and it's done at some, not instigation on the person's part, but like Hyde wasn't going out to look to murder, um, but it happens, and it's one murder that happens in the novella. But in any kind of iteration of Jekyll and Hyde, this is something. This is a being who you don't want to mess with, who would murder you in a heartbeat, and so forth. So that Jack the Ripper case really kind of colored in the public perception how we think of Jekyll and Hyde, even to this day. Unless you're looking at him as more of a, certainly in terms of the Wolfman. I mean, when we start to move in this duality of man archetype away from Jekyll and Hyde over to the Wolfman, then we really have solidified into that uncontrollable urge within you. Man has two natures, right? This starts in Jekyll and Hyde. What do they say in the Wolfman movie? Even a man who's pure of heart and says his prayers by night will become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms in the full moonlight. Anybody, no matter how good you are, you've got that base nature within you. You've got that wolf within inside of you. You've got that Mr. Hyde inside of you. And that's the battle of mankind. It's the plight of man. And it's certainly true, psychologically, religiously, whatever angle you have on it, definitely. So we see it all come from Jekyll and Hyde here. This is the basic premise. Now, with all of these stories, we're going to go far more deeply into it when we start looking at other iterations. Then we'll start looking at particularly what was in the book and how the archetype developed and changed and so forth. But I just trying to give us a good basic foundation in all of it first, because that'll help us understand and go forward. We are going to look at some important film adaptations. We'll talk about some of the stage adaptations. I gave kind of, a brief overview there of Stevenson and of Jekyll and Hyde, but we're going to come back to it. Don't worry. Just minding our time and everything. So, yeah.